1822. London. At the height of the British Empire's hunger for wealth and expansion, a Scottish officer walks into the financial heart of the city, carrying maps, official-looking documents, and an extraordinary promise. He claims to represent a distant Central American nation called Poyais, a land of fertile soil, golden rivers, waiting only for British settlers to arrive and claim the untapped riches. The story is irresistible. Banks listen. Investors lean forward. Newspapers print his claims as fact. According to this man, Poyais has a functioning government, a capital city, a grand opera house, and laws modeled on Britain itself. Land grants are available, government bonds are secure, and opportunity, he says, is guaranteed. Within months, the dream spreads like wildfire. Families sell their homes. Skilled workers abandon stable jobs. Entire futures are converted into paper promises, stamped with the seal of a country no one has ever seen. 2 ships are outfitted. Hundreds of settlers board them, convinced they are sailing toward prosperity and status in a new world. But when the ships finally arrive, the illusion collapses. There is no city, no government, no infrastructure. Only dense jungle, disease, starvation, and despair. They have been abandoned in a lie. By the time the truth reaches Europe, dozens are already dead. Entire families are gone, and the man responsible is back in London, walking free, respected, and already preparing his next deception. How did one man convince an empire to invest in a nation that never existed? Why did experienced bankers, politicians, and citizens believe him without question? And how did Gregor MacGregor pull off one of the deadliest cons in history and nearly escape unpunished? Long before the name Poyais ever appeared on maps or investment papers, Gregor MacGregor was simply a restless young man, born into a modest Scottish family. From an early age, MacGregor understood a hard truth about this world. Status mattered more than talent, and appearances mattered more than reality. To be treated like a hero, you didn't need to be brave. You just needed the right uniform. At just 16, MacGregor joined the British Army. On paper, it was a respectable path. In reality, the early 19th century British military was less a meritocracy and more a social theater. Commissions could be purchased. Advancement favored inheritance over performance. For MacGregor, this environment was perfect. He learned quickly that confidence could mask incompetence, and that authority, once assumed boldly enough, was rarely questioned. He adopted the posture of an officer effortlessly. His military career, however, was unremarkable. He never distinguished himself in battle, never earned lasting recognition, and never climbed as high as his ego demanded. What he did gain was far more valuable than medals: an education in systems of trust. He watched how uniforms silenced doubt and how paperwork replaced verification. The army taught him that belief, once established, could carry a man astonishingly far. After leaving British service, MacGregor drifted, dissatisfied and ambitious. Europe felt too small, too rigid, too aware of his limitations. But the wider world was changing. Across the Atlantic, revolution was sweeping through South America. Spain's colonies were breaking away, and newly forming governments were desperate for legitimacy, soldiers, and international recognition. To MacGregor, this chaos looked less like danger and more like opportunity. He sailed to South America and attached himself to various independence movements, presenting himself as a seasoned British officer with experience and influence. In truth, his role was exaggerated, but once again, confidence did the heavy lifting. In Venezuela and New Granada, he fought only when necessary, retreated whenever possible, and failed with a staggering consistency. Yet he didn't need a legacy when he had the audacity to simply invent one. Each setback became another story he could reshape. Each retreat turned into a strategic withdrawal. Each minor command became proof of greatness. Eventually, through a mix of charm and persistence, MacGregor built a monument of self-mythology, and he achieved something extraordinary. He convinced local leaders to grant him land on paper, territory he barely controlled, in regions barely mapped. He styled himself not merely as a soldier, but as a ruler. He adopted a title few Europeans would dare question: Cazique of Poyais, the Prince of Poyais, and just like that, the world realigned itself to fit his fiction. Gregor MacGregor had what he'd always wanted. Not power in practice, but power on parchment. All that remained was to find the right audience to believe it, and London was waiting. When Gregor MacGregor returned to London in the early 1820s, he didn't come back as a failed soldier or a wandering adventurer. He arrived as something far more powerful, a man with a story perfectly calibrated for his time. Britain was overflowing with capital, restless ambition, and a public intoxicated by imperial expansion. Investors were desperate for the next big colonial opportunity, and MacGregor knew exactly how to position himself as the gatekeeper to one. He began carefully, not with outrageous claims, but with quiet authority. He introduced himself as the cacique of Poyais, a legitimate ruler of a Central American territory granted to him by local leaders. He spoke with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, dropping military references, foreign names, and official titles with practiced ease. Most importantly, he produced documents, maps, land certificates, government bonds, each one meticulously designed to look authentic. In an era before instant verification, paper carried enormous power, and MacGregor had plenty of it. Poyais, he explained, was a paradise waiting for British civilization. The land was fertile, the climate mild, the rivers navigable. There were already ports, roads, and a capital city named St. Joseph, complete with public buildings and a functioning government modeled on Britain's own system. English was widely spoken. Laws protected private property. He assured them that the hardships of the New World had already been conquered. They wouldn't be pioneers, they would be inheritors. To make the scheme even more convincing, MacGregor added a final masterstroke. Investors and settlers were given the option to convert their British pound sterling into Poyais dollars, the official currency of the new nation. The money looked real. It carried seals, signatures, and elaborate designs. What the buyers didn't realize was that the currency was entirely fictional, printed and issued by MacGregor himself. But to his victims, many of them educated professionals and respected members of society, this detail didn't raise suspicion. It erased it. Nations had currencies, therefore, Poyais must be real. He wasn't offering them a struggle in the dirt, but a seat at the table of the elite. The brilliance of the con was not just in what MacGregor claimed, but in how reasonable it all sounded. This was the age of colonial charters and speculative ventures. New nations really were emerging in the Americas. British investors had already profited enormously from similar schemes. Poyais didn't feel like fantasy. It felt like timing. MacGregor moved quickly to legitimize the illusion. He persuaded a London publisher to release an official-looking guidebook describing Poyais in glowing detail, its geography, its economy, even its social customs. He established a Poyaisian government in exile, complete with offices in London. He appointed officials, he issued uniforms. He sold land titles and government bonds, assuring buyers that returns were guaranteed by the resources of an entire nation. Money poured in. Respectable bankers endorsed the bonds. Newspapers printed advertisements without skepticism. Clerks, doctors, craftsmen, and retired officers all saw the same opportunity: a fresh start with built-in status. This wasn't just investment, it was reinvention. And MacGregor made sure everyone felt personally chosen to be part of something historic. By the time doubts began to surface in quiet corners, the machinery was already in motion. 2 ships were commissioned. Supplies were loaded. Families said their goodbyes. The dream of Poyais had crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer just an idea, but a destination. Gregor watched it all unfold from the center of London society, calm and composed. He had done what few con artists ever manage. He hadn't just sold a lie to individuals, he had sold a country to an empire. And soon, hundreds of people would sail across the Atlantic to find out what that country really was. In late 1822, the first ship carrying settlers bound for Poyais finally left British shores. On board were families and professionals, doctors, carpenters, clerks, and widows with children, each one carrying documents that promised land ownership, status, and prosperity. They weren't sailing into the unknown, at least not in their minds. They believed they were heading toward a functioning country, one already prepared to receive them. After all, they had maps, they had charters, they had the word of a man introduced in London society as a legitimate ruler. The journey across the Atlantic was long and brutal, but morale remained high. Passengers spoke excitedly about the homes they would build, the farms they would establish, and the lives they would leave behind forever. They imagined streets, markets, and governance waiting for them on arrival. This was not a gamble, they told themselves. It was a calculated move into a better future. Reality struck the moment they reached the Mosquito Coast of Central America. There was no port, no docks, no welcoming officials, no city of St. Joseph rising from the shoreline. Only thick, unbroken jungle stretching inland, oppressive heat, and the sound of insects filling the air. At first, confusion dominated. Surely they had landed in the wrong place. Surely the capital lay further inland. But as days passed, it became impossible to deny the truth. There were no roads to follow, no buildings to find. Poyais, as they had been promised, did not exist. The settlers tried to survive anyway. They hacked at the jungle, attempting to clear land with inadequate tools. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Clean water was scarce. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, spread mercilessly through the camps. People who had arrived full of hope now weakened by the day. Children died first, then the elderly, then the strong. As conditions worsened, panic set in. Some settlers realized they had been deceived completely. Others clung desperately to the belief that help would arrive, that MacGregor would send ships, officials, or reinforcements. But no help came. The papers they carried, land grants, government seals, promises of protection, were meaningless here. Paper dissolved quickly in the rain. By the time rescue ships from nearby British colonies finally encountered the survivors months later, the settlement was a graveyard. Of the hundreds who had set out for Poyais, fewer than half were still alive. Many were too sick to stand, others were delirious. Entire families had vanished into the jungle or been buried in shallow graves along the coast. Months later, a second ship arrived from London carrying another 200 settlers. Instead of a thriving colony, they found a nightmare. A vast, untouched jungle and the poor, bedraggled survivors of the first voyage sick and barely clinging to life. Any remaining illusion shattered instantly. Panic replaced optimism. There was no possibility of success. Rescue efforts eventually evacuated some of the settlers to Honduras. In October 1823, around 50 survivors finally returned to London. They arrived weak, traumatized, and carrying a story so shocking it defied belief. News of the disaster began to leak out slowly, then all at once. The impossible truth became undeniable. A nation had been invented, and people had died believing in it. And at the center of it all was Gregor MacGregor, the man who had never set foot on Poyais with them, who had watched them sail away, and who was already preparing his escape from the consequences of the greatest lie he ever told. As survivors staggered back to British-controlled ports, word of the catastrophe spread through London. Investors demanded answers. Families demanded justice. Newspapers that once advertised land grants now published grim accounts of starvation, disease, and mass death in a jungle that never held a city. What had looked like a bold colonial venture was revealed as one of the most catastrophic frauds of the 19th century. For Gregor MacGregor, this should have been the end. But MacGregor had always understood something crucial about large-scale deception. By the time the truth becomes undeniable, the liar is already several steps ahead. When scrutiny intensified in Britain, he did not defend himself because he was already busy writing the next script. He did not stay to explain. He disappeared. Using the same confidence and reinvention that built Poyais, he slipped across borders. Reinventing his identity yet again, he fled to France. There, astonishingly, he attempted the scheme all over again. He reintroduced Poyais to a new audience, selling bonds and land grants to French investors who had not yet heard the full story. For a brief moment, the lie flickered back to life. But this time, the world was catching up. Survivors' testimonies spread faster. Governments paid closer attention. MacGregor was arrested and put on trial for fraud. Yet even then, he avoided real punishment. Courts struggled to define his crime. Colonial speculation was legal. Paper promises were slippery. He had not technically forced anyone onto those ships. Through legal ambiguity, charm, and the sheer novelty of his deception, MacGregor walked free once again. In his later years, the confidence that once carried him began to fade. He drifted between schemes and exaggerations, no longer capable of recreating the scale of his greatest con. Eventually, he returned to Venezuela, where revolutionary leaders, either unaware of his past or indifferent to it, granted him a modest pension for his earlier exaggerated service. Gregor MacGregor died in 1845, not in disgrace, not in prison, and not pursued by the law. He was buried with military honors. The victims of Poyais never received justice, the money was never recovered, and the man who invented a country, sold it to an empire, and watched people die believing in it, escaped almost entirely untouched. His story leaves behind an unsettling truth. History does not always punish its greatest liars. Sometimes it lets them walk away, while the cost of belief is paid by everyone else.